Caleb Turner had spent most of his 34 years believing that solitude was easier than disappointment. His ranch sat in a quiet valley tucked beneath the rolling hills of Wyoming Territory, where the nearest neighbor was several miles away and the only sounds most days were the wind sweeping through the tall grass, the distant call of hawks, and the steady rhythm of horses working the land. Life there was simple, demanding, and predictable, just the way Caleb preferred it. Or at least, that was what he told himself. Years earlier, a terrible accident had changed everything. While breaking a frightened stallion, Caleb had been thrown against a corral post, leaving a long scar stretching from his temple to his jaw. Though the injury healed, it left behind more than a mark on his face. It stole the confidence he had once carried. Every glance in a mirror reminded him that people noticed the scar before they noticed the man. As time passed, he stopped attending town dances, church socials, and harvest celebrations. Whenever friends suggested he should marry, Caleb only smiled politely and changed the subject. "A man like me doesn't need a wife," he often said. The truth was harder to admit. He believed no woman would ever willingly choose him. Still, ranch life required more than one pair of hands. The house stood quiet each evening, meals were hurried, clothes were mended only when absolutely necessary, and the long winters seemed to stretch endlessly. After years of encouragement from the local pastor and an elderly neighbor, Caleb reluctantly answered an advertisement from a marriage agency back east. He expected nothing. Weeks passed without a reply. Then, one chilly autumn morning, a letter arrived. The woman was named Eleanor Brooks. She was 26 years old, educated, kind, and searching for an honest husband willing to build a life together in the West. Her father had passed away several years earlier, leaving her widowed mother buried beneath debts that seemed impossible to escape. Rather than watch her family's future disappear, Eleanor had made the painful decision to become a mail-order bride. Her letters were thoughtful and sincere. She asked about the seasons, the horses, the ranch house, and whether Wyoming sunsets were truly as beautiful as people claimed. Caleb answered every question honestly. He never exaggerated his life. He admitted that the ranch was modest, the winters harsh, and that he wasn't much of a conversationalist. He even mentioned the scar across his face, fearing she should know before making such an important choice. Her reply surprised him. "Scars speak of survival," she wrote. Asterisk, "I value character far more than appearance." Asterisk. Even so, Caleb remained unconvinced. Words on paper were one thing. Reality was another. Several weeks later, the stagecoach rolled into the small frontier town where Caleb waited outside the general store, nervously adjusting the brim of his weathered hat. His palms felt unusually sweaty despite the cool breeze. Passengers slowly stepped down one by one. An elderly couple. A traveling salesman. A family with 2 small children. Then she appeared. Eleanor Brooks carefully descended the coach steps wearing a simple cream-colored traveling dress beneath a warm blue cloak. Sunlight caught the soft strands of chestnut hair escaping her bonnet, while curious green eyes quietly searched the crowd. For a long moment, Caleb forgot how to breathe. She looked nothing like the lonely picture he had imagined during their months of writing. She was graceful without trying to be, elegant despite the dust of travel, and carried herself with quiet confidence. She looked like someone who belonged in a grand city, not on an isolated cattle ranch. She noticed him almost immediately. Their eyes met. A warm smile spread across her face. "You must be Caleb Turner." He removed his hat awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am." She extended her gloved hand. "It's wonderful to finally meet you." Caleb stared at her for a second before carefully shaking her hand. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone nearby could hear it. Without thinking, the words escaped his mouth. You're far too beautiful for me." The moment they left his lips, he wished he could take them back. Embarrassed, he lowered his eyes toward the dusty street. "I reckon the agency must have sent the wrong lady." For a heartbeat there was only silence. Then Eleanor laughed, a soft, genuine laugh that held no mockery. "No," she said gently. "I'm exactly where I intended to be." Caleb blinked in surprise. She looked directly at the scar on his face without hesitation, without pity, and without discomfort. Instead, she looked into his eyes, as though the scar hardly mattered at all. "I've been looking forward to meeting the man who wrote such honest letters," she said. "I don't believe mistakes brought me here." Those simple words eased something inside Caleb that he had carried for years. As they climbed into the wagon for the long ride home, conversation came slowly but comfortably. Eleanor admired the endless prairie stretching toward the mountains, while Caleb pointed out grazing cattle, winding streams, and distant cottonwood trees glowing with autumn colors. The ranch was still hours away, and both knew they were traveling toward an uncertain future. They were strangers joined by a promise, carrying different fears but the same quiet hope, that perhaps, beyond loneliness and hardship, they might find the beginning of a home neither had ever truly expected. Caleb's ranch came into view just as the last light of the sun painted the Wyoming hills in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor sat quietly beside him on the wagon seat, taking in the wide-open landscape. She had never imagined land stretching so far in every direction, with only fences, grazing cattle, and scattered cottonwood trees breaking the horizon. "It feels like the whole world is out here," she whispered. Caleb smiled faintly. "Some days, it does." The ranch house was modest, a sturdy two-story wooden home with a wide porch, a weathered red barn, several horse corrals, and a windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. Chickens wandered freely through the yard while two ranch dogs barked excitedly as the wagon rolled in. Eleanor studied the house carefully. It wasn't grand, but it felt cared for. Fresh firewood had been stacked neatly beside the porch. Window boxes held late-blooming wildflowers, and every fence had recently been repaired. Though simple, the ranch reflected the man who owned it, quiet, dependable, and hard-working. Caleb climbed down first. "I know it isn't much," he said, avoiding her eyes. "But everything here is paid for. No debts. Just honest work." Eleanor looked at him with a gentle smile. "It feels like a home." Those 4 words caught Caleb completely off guard. No one had ever complimented the place before. He carried her small trunk inside while Eleanor followed, pausing in the doorway. The house was clean but plainly furnished. A stone fireplace warmed the main room, where a wooden table stood near the kitchen. Shelves held carefully arranged jars of preserves, flour, coffee, and dried herbs. Everything had its place. "You cleaned all this yourself?" she asked. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "I had some help from Mrs. Harper down the road. She insisted a lady shouldn't arrive to find dust everywhere." Eleanor laughed softly. "She sounds kind. She can also be very stubborn." For the first time that day, Caleb heard Eleanor laugh freely, and the sound made the house seem less empty. After supper, a simple meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apples, they sat across from each other at the table. Conversation came slowly. Both wanted to learn about the other but feared asking too much. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "Your letters mentioned your parents built this ranch." Caleb nodded. "My father started with 50 acres and a handful of cattle. We worked together until he passed. My mother died the winter before." "I'm sorry." He shrugged gently. "It was a long time ago." Eleanor understood that some grief never truly disappeared. She told him about her own family. "My father owned a small bookstore in Boston. After he died, business failed. We sold nearly everything trying to pay his debts." "And your mother?" "She still lives there. I send what little money I can." Caleb listened carefully. "You must miss her." "Every day." A quiet settled between them, not awkward this time, but thoughtful. When supper ended, Caleb stood. "I prepared the upstairs bedroom for you." Eleanor looked surprised. And where will you sleep? The downstairs room. She frowned. But, we're married. Caleb's face turned slightly red. I know. He hesitated before speaking again. I don't expect anything from you, Eleanor. We barely know each other. I figured you'd be more comfortable having your own room until you decide how you feel about all this. His words carried such sincere respect that Eleanor felt a warmth she hadn't expected. Most women who became mail-order brides feared demanding husbands or strangers who viewed marriage as ownership. Caleb was offering her patience instead. Thank you, she said quietly. He simply nodded. I'll bring your trunk upstairs. Later that evening, Eleanor unpacked her belongings. The room was simple but welcoming. Fresh quilts covered the bed, lace curtains framed the windows, and a small vase filled with wildflowers rested on the dresser. She smiled. Caleb had clearly placed them there. Downstairs, Caleb sat alone by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He replayed every moment of the day. She had been polite, kind, grateful. But surely, he thought, once she experienced the hardships of ranch life, she'd regret coming west. She's too refined, he muttered. Too educated. Too beautiful. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that she deserved someone better. The next morning, Caleb was awake before sunrise. He quietly saddled the horses, fed the livestock, and completed nearly half the morning chores before Eleanor came downstairs. She wore a plain blue work dress instead of the elegant traveling clothes from the day before. I hope you don't mind, she said. I thought this might be more practical. Caleb blinked. You packed work dresses? I expected to live on a ranch. He almost smiled. Mrs. Harper arrived shortly after breakfast carrying a basket of homemade biscuits. She embraced Eleanor warmly. So you're the brave young lady who agreed to marry this stubborn rancher. Caleb groaned. Mrs. Harper. Ignoring him completely, the elderly woman whispered loudly enough for Caleb to hear, he pretends to be made of stone, but he's got the softest heart in 3 counties. Eleanor glanced at Caleb, who looked ready to disappear from embarrassment. She couldn't help smiling. As the morning passed, Mrs. Harper showed Eleanor the pantry, garden, chicken coop, and smokehouse while Caleb worked outside repairing a fence. From the kitchen window, Eleanor watched him. He worked steadily without complaint, stopping only to help a calf caught beneath a broken rail. He spoke gently to frightened animals, fixed every problem with quiet patience, and never seemed to expect praise. She remembered the first thing he'd said when they met. You're far too beautiful for me. She now understood those words hadn't been flattery. They had come from years of believing he wasn't worthy of being loved. Standing at the window, Eleanor made a silent promise to herself. She hadn't traveled across the country merely to survive. She had come to build a marriage. And somehow, she intended to help Caleb Turner see the goodness that everyone else could already see. The first snowfall arrived earlier than anyone expected. A thin blanket of white settled across the ranch, covering the fields, fences, and rooftops in quiet silence. Caleb rose before dawn as always, pulling on his heavy coat before heading to the barn. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as he disappeared into the cold, carrying 2 buckets of feed as if the freezing wind didn't bother him. Nearly 3 months had passed since she had become his wife. The ranch no longer felt unfamiliar. She could gather eggs without chasing chickens across the yard, bake fresh bread that even Caleb praised, and saddle a horse without asking for help. Every evening, husband and wife shared supper together, talking a little more than they had the day before. Yet one thing had not changed. Caleb still treated her like a guest. He never reached for her hand. Never called her my wife when they visited town. Never assumed she wanted to stay. Sometimes Eleanor caught him watching her from across the room, only for him to quickly look away the moment she noticed. It both puzzled and saddened her. One Saturday they rode into Willow Creek to buy supplies before winter grew harsher. The general store buzzed with neighbors stocking up on flour, coffee, blankets, and lamp oil. As Caleb loaded sacks into the wagon outside, a polished black carriage stopped in front of the store. A tall, well-dressed man stepped down, adjusting his expensive leather gloves. "Well," he said with an easy smile, "I was told the stories were true." Eleanor looked up politely. "You must be Mrs. Turner." "I am." The man tipped his hat. "Richard Hawthorne." She recognized the name immediately. Richard owned one of the largest ranches in the county. Unlike Caleb, he had inherited wealth instead of building it. His fine clothes and confident manner made that obvious. "I've heard quite a bit about you," Richard continued. Eleanor smiled politely. "I hope only good things." "Oh, mostly that the prettiest woman in Wyoming somehow married the quietest rancher." Before she could answer, Caleb returned carrying another sack of feed. His smile faded slightly when he saw Richard. "Morning." Richard nodded. "Caleb." There was an unmistakable tension between the two men. Richard glanced toward Eleanor again. "I was just saying your wife seems wasted on a lonely ranch." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Our ranch suits us just fine." Richard chuckled. "If you say so." He tipped his hat once more before climbing back into his carriage. "I hope we'll meet again, Mrs. Turner." As the carriage rolled away, Caleb quietly finished loading the wagon. The ride home felt unusually silent. Finally Eleanor asked, "Have you known him long?" "Too long." "You don't like him?" "He likes collecting things." "What kind of things?" Caleb stared ahead at the snowy trail. "Land." He paused. "And sometimes people." The words lingered in Eleanor's mind. Over the following weeks, rumors began spreading through Willow Creek. Some claimed Eleanor regretted marrying a lonely rancher. Others whispered she had only come west because she had no other choice. A few even suggested Richard Hawthorne intended to convince her to leave Caleb. Most gossip reached Caleb before it reached Eleanor. He never repeated it. But each rumor quietly chipped away at the little confidence he had begun to build. Late one evening, after finishing chores, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table. A folded document rested beside a pen. Eleanor entered carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. "What are you writing?" He hesitated. "Something important." She noticed the legal heading across the page. "What is it?" Caleb took a slow breath. If you've changed your mind." She looked confused. These papers would end the marriage. Her heart sank. "You want a divorce?" "No." His answer came immediately. "I want you to be free." He lowered his eyes. "I know this isn't the life you imagined. If you'd rather leave now than spend years unhappy, I won't stand in your way." For several long seconds Eleanor simply stared at him. Then she picked up the papers. Caleb expected her to read them carefully. Instead, she calmly tore them straight down the middle. Then again. And again. The pieces drifted onto the floor like snowflakes. Caleb blinked in complete surprise. "Eleanor." She stepped closer until they stood only inches apart. "Do you know what hurts most?" He slowly shook his head. "You still don't believe me." "What?" "You believe gossip more than you believe your own wife." He looked stunned. "I chose you, Caleb." She gently placed her hand over his rough, calloused one. "I didn't marry your ranch. I didn't marry your cattle. I certainly didn't marry your money." A small smile touched her lips. "You don't have much of that anyway." For the first time all evening, Caleb laughed quietly. "I married the man who wrote honest letters. The man who gave me my own room because he respected me. The man who works until his hands bleed so everyone around him is cared for." She squeezed his hand. That is the man I love. Caleb felt his throat tighten. No one had ever spoken about him that way. I thought. He whispered. I know what you thought. She looked directly into his eyes. You thought I deserved someone richer. She smiled warmly. I already have someone better. For the first time since the day she stepped off the stagecoach, Caleb allowed himself to believe something he had never dared imagine. Perhaps Eleanor hadn't settled for him. Perhaps she had truly chosen him. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley, but spring did not bring the relief Caleb had hoped for. The snow melted quickly, yet the rains never came. Day after day, the sky remained a cloudless blue, and the earth grew drier beneath the relentless sun. By early summer, the creek that ran through the Turner Ranch had shrunk to a narrow ribbon of water. The grass turned brittle, and dust rose with every hoofbeat. Ranchers across the county worried that if the drought continued, many would lose their cattle before autumn. Every morning before sunrise, Caleb rode across his land, searching for patches of fresh grazing. Eleanor often accompanied him, carrying water and keeping careful notes of which pastures still had enough grass for the herd. We'll make it, she said one morning, trying to sound hopeful. Caleb smiled, though worry filled his eyes. We've survived hard years before. Despite his confidence, he knew the drought had made every ranch vulnerable. Hungry cattle were valuable. Desperate men could become dangerous. One evening, Caleb returned from checking the western fence and found the gate standing open. He frowned. I locked this before I left. Fresh hoofprints covered the dusty ground. Someone had been there. He followed the tracks until they disappeared beyond the ridge. When he returned, he found 2 steers missing. They've been stolen, he said quietly. Eleanor's face paled. Cattle rustlers? He nodded. They're testing us. The next morning, Caleb rode into Willow Creek to report the theft. Sheriff Amos Briggs promised to keep watch, but he admitted there was little he could do without knowing who was responsible. Keep your eyes open, the sheriff warned. These gangs rarely stop after taking only a couple of head. Caleb thanked him and headed home with a heavy heart. For the next week, neither Caleb nor Eleanor slept well. Every unfamiliar sound outside made them sit upright in bed. The ranch hands took turns standing watch at night, rifles resting across their laps as they circled the corrals. Eleanor prepared coffee for the weary men before dawn each morning. They're exhausted, she whispered. So am I, Caleb admitted. Still, he refused to leave the ranch unguarded. The attack came just after midnight. One of the ranch dogs began barking wildly. A gunshot shattered the silence. Then another. Caleb was on his feet before Eleanor could even light the lantern. Stay inside, he ordered as he reached for his rifle. I'm coming with you. No. He looked at her firmly. Lock the doors. Before she could argue, he disappeared into the darkness. Outside, horses neighed in panic as masked riders drove frightened cattle toward the open gate. There they are, one outlaw shouted. Caleb fired a warning shot into the air. The rustlers answered with bullets of their own. Wood splintered from the fence beside him. 2 loyal ranch hands rushed forward from the barn, helping Caleb force the herd back toward the corrals. The valley echoed with shouting, pounding hooves, and gunfire. Inside the house, Eleanor refused to sit helplessly. She filled bandages, boiled water, and loaded extra ammunition into a canvas bag. When one of the ranch hands stumbled toward the porch with a wounded shoulder, she quickly pulled him inside. You'll be all right, she said calmly, wrapping the injury while bullets echoed outside. Suddenly she heard another cry. Looking through the window, she saw one of the youngest ranch hands trapped beside a frightened horse that had become tangled in broken fencing. A rustler was riding straight toward him. Without hesitation, Eleanor grabbed Caleb's spare rifle and ran outside. She fired one shot into the air. The sound startled both horses. The outlaw turned toward her, giving the young ranch hand enough time to escape. At that exact moment, Caleb saw the danger. Eleanor. A rustler raised his rifle. Caleb spurred his horse forward, placing himself between the gunman and his wife. The shot rang out. Caleb cried out as the bullet struck his upper shoulder. He nearly fell from the saddle but managed to stay upright. Seeing several ranchers racing toward the fight from neighboring properties, the rustlers realized they had lost the advantage. "Ride!" their leader shouted. Within moments, the gang disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind scattered cattle and broken fences. The battle was over. But Caleb collapsed before reaching the porch. Eleanor caught him as he slid from the saddle. "Caleb." His shirt was soaked with blood. "I'm all right," he whispered through clenched teeth. "You most certainly are not." With help from the ranch hands, she carried him inside. Throughout the long night, Eleanor cleaned the wound, stopped the bleeding, and sat beside him, refusing to leave even for a moment. Near dawn, Caleb finally opened his eyes. "The cattle?" he asked weakly. She smiled through tears. "They're safe." "And you?" "I'm safe because you came for me." He looked at her with tired eyes. "I'll always come for you." Eleanor gently took his hand. "And next time," she said softly, "we'll face the danger together." Outside, the first rays of sunrise spread across the battered ranch. Broken fences could be rebuilt, and frightened cattle could be gathered again. But in the quiet room upstairs, something even stronger had taken root. Neither Caleb nor Eleanor thought of themselves as two lonely strangers anymore. They had become partners, bound not only by marriage, but by courage, sacrifice, and a love willing to stand firm against any storm the frontier could bring. Caleb remained confined to the house for nearly 3 weeks while his shoulder healed. The doctor from Willow Creek had removed the bullet and assured Eleanor that, with enough rest, her husband would recover completely. Rest, however, was something Caleb Turner had never learned to do. On the third morning after the attack, Eleanor walked into the bedroom carrying breakfast only to find the bed empty. Her eyes widened. "Caleb?" She hurried outside and discovered him standing near the barn, trying to lift a heavy sack of grain with one arm. She crossed the yard with her hands on her hips. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Caleb looked like a boy caught stealing apples. "It wasn't that heavy." Eleanor folded her arms. "The doctor said no work." "I was only helping." "You were reopening your wound." Before he could argue, she gently took the sack from him and handed it to one of the ranch hands. "From now on," she declared, "you'll supervise." The ranch hands exchanged amused glances. One of them whispered, "Looks like the boss has a new boss." Even Caleb laughed. "Seems I do." While Caleb recovered, Eleanor managed nearly every part of the ranch. She organized supplies, hired 2 extra hands for the harvest, kept detailed account books, and even negotiated fair prices with merchants in Willow Creek. Many of the older ranchers had doubted whether a woman raised in the East could handle frontier life. Those doubts quickly disappeared. One afternoon, Sheriff Amos Briggs stopped by with news. The rustlers were caught crossing into Colorado. Caleb looked relieved. "All of them?" "Every last one." Their leader confessed to targeting smaller ranches first, hoping folks would be too frightened to fight back. Eleanor smiled. "They chose the wrong ranch." The sheriff nodded. "I'd say they certainly did." As summer faded into autumn, life slowly returned to normal. The repaired fences stood stronger than before. Healthy calves filled the pastures. The creek, refreshed by late rains, once again flowed through the valley. One evening Caleb and Eleanor rode together to the highest hill overlooking their land. The sunset painted the sky with brilliant shades of orange, crimson, and gold. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Caleb broke the silence. "Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you?" Eleanor smiled. "You're far too beautiful for me." He sighed, embarrassed. I must have sounded like a fool. You sounded honest. Caleb stared toward the horizon. I meant every word. He paused. I've spent most of my life believing I wasn't enough. She listened quietly. After the accident, after the scar. He touched the side of his face unconsciously. People looked at me differently. I convinced myself no woman could ever truly love me. He looked down at his hands. So when you stepped off that stagecoach. He laughed softly. I thought God had made some sort of mistake. Eleanor reached over and gently took his hand. He didn't. Caleb's voice grew quieter. I fell in love with you that very day. You did. The moment you smiled at me. He swallowed hard. But I kept telling myself you'd eventually realize you deserved someone better. She shook her head. Oh, Caleb. I almost let you go because I thought it would make you happier. I know. She smiled tenderly. And that's exactly why I fell in love with you. He looked at her in surprise. You never tried to impress me. You never promised riches. You never pretended to be someone else. Instead, she continued, you showed me kindness every single day. You respected me before you even loved me. You gave me freedom when other men would have demanded obedience. She squeezed his hand. I didn't fall in love with the ranch. I fell in love with the man who quietly put everyone else's happiness before his own. Tears gathered in Caleb's eyes. No one had ever described him that way. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb slid off his horse and walked around to help Eleanor down. Standing together beneath the fading evening sky, he reached into his coat pocket. I've been carrying this for weeks. He opened his hand. Inside rested 2 simple gold bands. I know we're already married, he said with a nervous smile. But I'd like to marry you again. She laughed softly through happy tears. You already have me. I know. But this time. He took a deep breath. I'd like to ask with confidence. Eleanor Brooks Turner. He knelt despite his healing shoulder. Will you spend the rest of your life choosing me, the way you've already done every day since you arrived? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Every day. A week later, friends and neighbors gathered beneath the giant cottonwood tree beside the ranch house. Mrs. Harper cried openly through the entire ceremony. Sheriff Briggs smiled as though attending the wedding of his own children. Even the ranch hands cleaned themselves up and wore their best clothes. The pastor looked at Caleb. Do you take this woman to continue building a life of faith, love, and honor? With absolute certainty, Caleb answered. I do. Then the pastor turned to Eleanor. And do you choose this man? She smiled directly into Caleb's eyes. I already did. As they shared their first kiss beneath the autumn sky, applause echoed across the valley. For the first time in many years, Caleb no longer saw himself as the lonely rancher with a scar. He saw himself as the husband of the woman who had taught him the greatest lesson of all. True love begins the moment someone sees your heart, and chooses to stay. 5 years passed, and the Turner Ranch became known throughout the valley for more than its healthy cattle or fertile grazing land. Travelers spoke of it as a place where every guest was welcomed with a warm meal, a safe bed, and genuine kindness. The lonely ranch that had once echoed with silence was now filled with laughter. Children's voices drifted across the fields from sunrise until dusk. Caleb often paused during his work just to listen. Those sounds were treasures he had never imagined would one day belong to him. On a bright spring morning, Caleb stood beside the corral, helping his 8-year-old son, Thomas, learn to saddle a gentle mare. Not so tight, Caleb said with a smile. The horse needs to breathe, too. Thomas loosened the strap and grinned. Like this? Perfect. Nearby, 6-year-old Grace chased chickens through the yard while laughing so loudly that Eleanor stepped onto the porch pretending to scold her. Young lady, she called. Grace froze dramatically. Yes, Mama. The chickens would appreciate a peaceful afternoon. Grace giggled. I was only racing them. The chickens don't seem interested in winning. Everyone laughed. Caleb watched his family with quiet amazement. There had been a time when he believed he would grow old completely alone. Now every corner of the ranch carried reminders of the life they had built together. Inside the house, Eleanor had transformed the once plain ranch home into a place filled with warmth. Fresh flowers stood in every window. Handmade quilts covered each bed. Books lined shelves Caleb had built with his own hands. Every Sunday evening, neighbors gathered around the long dining table for supper. Widows who had no family nearby, traveling cowboys passing through, and young couples just starting their lives were always invited. No one should eat alone, Eleanor often said. Caleb agreed. He knew exactly how loneliness felt. One afternoon a young couple arrived at the ranch seeking directions. Their wagon wheel had broken nearly 10 miles away. The husband looked embarrassed. I'm sorry to trouble you. You aren't troubling us, Caleb replied. We've got spare lumber in the barn. While Caleb repaired the wagon, Eleanor prepared a hearty meal. The young bride quietly watched them together. Finally she smiled. I hope my husband and I grow old the way you two have. Eleanor looked toward Caleb, who was laughing with the young man while fitting the new wheel into place. So do I, she answered softly. That evening, after their visitors continued west, Caleb and Eleanor walked together toward the hill overlooking the ranch. The sunset looked much the same as it had on the evening Caleb had first confessed his love. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. They sat beneath the old cottonwood tree where they had renewed their vows years before. Caleb reached for Eleanor's hand, something that now came as naturally as breathing. You know, he said with a chuckle, I still think about the day you stepped off that stagecoach. She smiled knowingly. I was hoping you would. He laughed. I honestly believed the agency had made a terrible mistake. You told me so. I certainly did. He shook his head. You're far too beautiful for me. Eleanor leaned gently against his shoulder. And I remember thinking. She paused with a playful smile. That you were the most honest man I'd ever met. Caleb looked toward the ranch where Thomas and Grace were helping the ranch hands gather horses for the evening. I wasted so many years believing I wasn't worthy of being loved. Eleanor gently squeezed his hand. No. You were simply waiting for someone who could see what was already there. He smiled. You always know what to say. I only tell the truth. For a while they simply watched the children playing below. The valley glowed beneath the golden light of the setting sun. The repaired fences stretched across healthy fields. The cattle grazed peacefully. Smoke curled gently from the chimney of the house that had become the heart of their family. Everything around them had grown stronger through hardship. So had they. As darkness slowly settled across the Wyoming hills, Thomas ran toward them with Grace close behind. Mama! Papa! Thomas shouted excitedly. Mrs. Harper says supper is ready. Grace grabbed Caleb's hand. And she baked apple pie. Caleb laughed. Now that's news worth hurrying for. The four of them walked back toward the house together. Just before reaching the porch, Caleb stopped and looked at Eleanor. I've been meaning to tell you something. She raised an eyebrow. What is it? He smiled the same shy smile she had first seen years ago. You're still far too beautiful for me. Eleanor laughed, her eyes shining with happiness. She cupped his face gently, brushing her thumb across the scar he had once believed made him unlovable. No, Caleb. She kissed his forehead. I simply married the most handsome heart in the whole West. Hand in hand, surrounded by their children, faithful friends, and the ranch they had built together, they stepped inside their home. The door closed against the cool evening breeze, but the warmth within remained, a warmth born not from wealth, appearance, or perfect circumstances, but from kindness, trust, sacrifice, and a love that had been worth every mile, every trial, and every moment of waiting. And so, the lonely rancher who once believed he would never be enough discovered the greatest truth of his life. The right person does not choose you because you are perfect. They choose you because your heart feels like home. The end.